page that I gave out, if you would just write on these two books. They're not. The Shadow of His Wings by Father Gary Goldman is a autobiography. He was drafted into the SS, although he was already ordained a priest, and he conducted an underground ministry in the SS, and they tried killing him during the war and when he was in a POW camp. It's a very powerful book. And then The Scarlet and the Black is on the life of Monsignor Hugh Flaherty, who was an Irish priest who was working at the Vatican at the time that the war broke out. And he set up an entire conduit through the Italians of rescuing Allied airmen who had been shot down and getting them rescued, even getting them out of prison camps, and then also for helping anti-fascist Italians and Jews to find refuge and sanctuary. The movie is very good except for one scene. There's one scene, totally unnecessary, not in the book because it didn't happen, where Pius XII takes Monsignor Flaherty down into the catacombs of St. Peter's to explain why he has to be careful. And in the scene it shows all these paintings and treasures from the museum upstairs that have all been moved. And he says, you know, this is the whole heritage of the church and this is what I'm really concerned about. Which is a lie, because at the time what was in the catacombs were Jewish refugees and Italian anti-fascists who were wanted by the government. So something like that didn't happen, has no basis in fact, and yet the producers felt obligated to throw that in there. Comes out of what we're talking about tonight. So Hitler's Pope, the title comes from this book. It is unfortunately an international bestseller, as it says. And the photograph shows German soldiers as Eugenio Pacelli comes out of a German-owned building. And in the English copies, this is the original cover. When it was published overseas in America and Canada and elsewhere, what they did was they blurred the photo, getting rid of the car door. The car door is square, and it shows you it's a car from the 20s. And getting rid of, moving that over and blurring the background and the chauffeur's uniform so that he looks like a soldier. So it's deliberately done to give the impression that it's the Pope coming out and being saluted by Nazi soldiers, which it isn't. The photo is actually from 1927 when he was the ambassador to Germany. And it was just, he had gone to a reception, was coming out, and the government, soldiers were there, and that was it. That was perfectly normal. But Cornwell was a former seminarian who was very angry at the church, very bitter, and lied in his book. And he lied after the book was published. When people challenged him, he said, "Oh, I spent 3 weeks in Rome, and I went through all the Vatican archives, and I found smoking guns." He spent 3 weeks in Rome, but then went in the archives a couple times, and he didn't spend more than a couple hours. Because when you go in the archives, you have to sign in and sign out. And you have to get permission to go into some of the stuff that he was claiming he saw, and he never saw it. So that unfortunately fits in with a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Okay, can you be the next one? So, Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII in 1939. He was born to a pro-papal family in 1876 in Rome. Now you would say, isn't everybody in Rome at that time pro-papal? No, they were not. Italy was united in 1870, and the nobility split into two factions. He comes from a very old family in Rome, and in Rome when you say somebody is an old family, it means they're really old. They go back, over 1,000 years. So, well over 1,000 years. So his family belonged to what's called the black nobility. And the black nobility were the ones that would not accept the new kingdom of Italy. Because the new kingdom of Italy came in with an anti-church attitude. the great uniter of Italy, Garibaldi, was very anti-clerical, did not care for priests, did not care for the church, did not care for the faith. And the royal family was Catholic, but they went along with that in order to get the peninsula united. So that's why I specified that. He's born to a pro-papal family. So he was ordained in 1899. He trained for the Papal Diplomatic Corps and was stationed mostly in the German countries. Now, he joins the Secretariat of State in 1914, which is when World War I broke out. He joined it before that happened. And you don't join the Secretariat, you don't apply. The Secretary of State looks for you. So they looked for him because he was up and coming. And during the war, he was assigned as the ambassador to Bavaria. The kingdoms in Germany, the big kingdoms like Bavaria and Württemberg, and all still had the ability to run their own governments. And they had diplomatic relations. Bavaria is traditionally the Catholic heart of Germany. The center and southern part of the country is. And because of this, he was the only papal diplomat in the entire German Empire. At the end of 1918, the German and Austro-Hungarian empires collapsed, and a communist revolution was launched in all parts of Germany. And in Bavaria itself, his life was threatened. In 1920, he became ambassador to the Weimar Republic. And the Weimar Republic was the German democracy. It was a weak government, unfortunately, and it had some flaws in it, which led to the Nazis. So he also was involved, while he was ambassador to the Republic in Berlin, he was involved with the negotiations to the Soviet Union, both to get food aid, because they were in a famine, and also to get relief for the church, which they accepted the food from the Pope, but they didn't get, the church got no relief. And during his time in Germany, out of the 44 speeches he gave as the nuncio, 40 were condemned. 40 were condemning the Nazis. So even before the Nazis took over. Fascism. Right? Hitler is profoundly influenced by Mussolini. And in 1922, Mussolini is named the premier of Italy by the king, and he establishes fascist rule. There were many Jewish fascists, because there were a lot of stuff the fascists said people liked. They were a conservative force against the communists. They were in favor of private property. Initially, they came across as kind of a law and order party. And so Jewish people had no problem joining the fascists. Later, they're expelled from the fascists. Hitler tries to launch a coup d'etat against the government called the Beer Hall Putsch, based in Munich. In 1923, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Unfortunately, he only served 1 year. Big mistake on the part of the Bavarians. And while he's in prison, he writes Mein Kampf. In 1929, the Lateran Treaty restores the independence of the Holy See. When Italy was united, the Pope becomes what's called the prisoner of the Vatican. And he did not come out after Italy was united, because when they took over Rome, the royal family moved into the Pope's palace, and he was not guaranteed even safe conduct from the Vatican Palace to the cathedral, which is St. John Lateran. And they confiscated a lot of property, they confiscated a lot of religious buildings, and there was persecution of the church. And so the treaty had to be negotiated. How was Italy going to get along with Catholicism? And the treaty guarantees the independence of Vatican City and also of all Vatican-owned buildings, which becomes very important during the war. And it allowed for Catholic action, for lay activity, but not a political party. They could no longer have a Catholic popular party. That was forbidden, which was a weakness. In 1931, the Vatican condemns fascism in Non Abbiamo Signo, the only encyclical written in Italian. And it was written in Italian so that everybody could read it and everybody could understand that Pius XI was anti-fascist and condemned what the fascists were doing. And they were beating people up, they were suppressing free press, there was murders and assassinations, there was all kinds of violence under the fascists. So, and Hitler took a lot of notes from Mussolini. Mussolini was his real mentor. 1929 is the Great Depression and the economic crisis because all of the countries put up trade barriers, including America, and a lot of Europe's trade came here. And we put up trade barriers to try and save what we could of our own industry and farming, and all the other countries did the same thing. And that weakened all the countries' economies. So what happens in Germany? So in 1930, this is where the word Nazi comes from. So it's Nationalischer Deutscher Sozialistischer is first. So it's the National Socialist German Workers' Party. This is a big, long name. And so they were national, and in German it's Nationalistischer. So people shortened it to Nazi because it's such a long name. But they were national, they were socialist, which most people don't realize, German nationalists, and Arbeiter, for the workers, as a political party, the NSDAP. So the word Nazi comes out of that. So when the elections are held in 1930, they get 30% of the vote. At the time, there was a lot of street fighting between the communists and the conservatives. And there was, it was almost constant. And they had experienced heavy inflation. My grandmother told me that she remembered her mother getting letters from Germany and saying that they put the banknotes into a wheelbarrow to go shopping. And you had to go shopping first thing in the morning because the prices would go up in the afternoon. So that bread that cost 12 marks at the worst part of hyperinflation cost 100 billion marks. And the money was worthless. And in these years, they've gotten the inflation down, but it's not gone by any means. And they have incredible unemployment, 30%. You know, if you have 6% unemployment, that's an unhealthy economy. 30% is outrageous. And there was a lot of fear of a Soviet takeover like it had happened at the end of World War I. The communists had had successful revolutions, and they were calling for a revolution. They're pointing to Stalin's Russia, you know, as the way to go. In 1932, they have the next round of elections, and in July, this is the highest number of votes that the Nazis ever got. So 37.1. They never went above that. And then the communists were next, Social Democrats, which was a middle-of-the-road socialist party, and then Catholic Center was next. In 1932, same year, their numbers are already dropping. They lose 2 million votes in that round of voting. But in 1933, the country is still in crisis. Hindenburg is the president, and his cabinet recommended that he ask Hitler to become premier, because since the votes were going down, they figured he would realize, you know, that he doesn't have the control, the support that he claimed, and therefore they would, he could be controlled better by Hindenburg. A big mistake. You know, instead of, they didn't want a communist, and they didn't want a socialist. They couldn't have a Catholic, because the country was only 1/3 Catholic, and there was a lot of anti-Catholicism in Germany. So, you know, they didn't know who else to go to. Because they had 13 political parties in Germany at this time. So, trying to find leader, Hitler came across as one, and his talk was very pro-Christian, pro-family, pro-life, pro-business. He had all the right pros. Now, he becomes the chancellor. Chancellor is like president, right? Our president. Okay, Hindenburg was the president of Germany, but in their system, the president is a ceremonial office. The chancellor is where all the power is, and that's still the way they're set up today. On February 27th, the Reichstag burns. That's the Parliament building in Berlin, and they caught a communist, a Dutch communist, who readily said he set it on fire as a protest against the Nazis. Okay. So Hindenburg panics, and he signs all these decrees that Hitler brings him. So suppressing the Constitution's defense of individual rights, the free press, private property, privacy of mail. All the things that Hitler said he was against doing, he does right away. And Hindenburg by this time was very old and he was getting senile. So it was easy to panic him. So what they do is in February they conduct these large-scale arrests of Catholics in these 6 days between the Reichstag fire and the elections. They had this big roundup of Catholics and communists as the two opponents of Germany. And all these different men and women are arrested and thrown into prisons. The elections held on March 15th. The German Workers' Party gets 43%. The SPD, the Socialists, 20%. Communists, 16.8%. Their support had dropped. They're now third. Catholic Center Party, 12%. Nationalists, 8.3%. Bavarian People's Party, which is the same as the Catholics, 3%. Now, this is where Catholics were in Germany in 1933. So after World War II, see, all of this is cut off and given to Poland. And half of East Prussia, and the other half went to the Soviet Union. Why did they do that? Because Stalin wanted Eastern Poland, and Roosevelt and Churchill said, oh yeah, sure, we'll give it to you. And they just moved the border in, the Polish border. But then the Poles wanted compensation for what they had suffered, and so they said, oh yeah, sure, we'll move the German border over. Okay, so 12 million people lived over there who were all thrown out. But in 1933, this was Germany. So the black areas are where Catholics are concentrated. Okay, so look at that, and now the white areas show the anti-Nazi votes. Go back to the other one. You see what the pattern is. The Catholic regions voted, there you go. The Catholic regions is where the anti-Nazi votes were cast. So the black, now this little white spot here is Berlin. Berlin voted socialist. That was the socialist strength. They hated Hitler in Berlin. When he took over, people hated him. They made jokes about him. They threw tomatoes and eggs at him. They despised Hitler. And of course, at the end of the war, Berlin is cut into 4 parts. And there was a Berlin joke saying, yeah, this is what we get. This is how the Allies treat us for being so against Hitler. They carve our city up. But that is the pattern. There's no going against it. Okay. So, in July of 1933, the Concordat was signed. The Concordat is a treaty that is signed by the Holy See as the government and another government. So, Holy See is different from the Church because the Holy See is what countries have diplomatic relations with. This is what the Lateran Treaty guaranteed freedom to the Holy See in Vatican City. The Vatican never negotiates a concordat with a friendly government. There's no concordat with the United States. There's no need for a concordat because we live freely. But in Germany, there was a long history of anti-Catholicism going back to the 1890s. And there was also already the arrests that had taken place, and there was tremendous pressure being put on Catholic institutions. Pope Pius XI wanted this treaty because with the treaty, he could have something to stand on for the defense of Catholics' rights in the Third Reich. Do you know why it's the Third Reich? The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted 500 years. The Second Reich was the Weimar Republic, which only lasted from 1920 to 1933. Third Reich, of course, was going to last how long?
Forever.
1,000 years, yeah, forever, yeah. So the critics of Eugenio Pacelli say this, that the Concordat gave official recognition to Hitler and his policies before any other country recognized him, that his long residence in Germany made him overly sympathetic to German culture and to all Germans. And he had done this. He had negotiated concordats with 3 German states, Bavaria, Prussia, and Baden, because they still had the right, before the Nazis took over, they had the right to diplomatic relations. Okay. These are the reasons. The Enabling Act that the Reichstag passed gave Hitler full power. After they passed it, he shut down the Reichstag. He got rid of the parliament. They needed a national concordat because Hitler centralized all power in Berlin. All these states lost their authority. They lost their autonomy. And then the great quote from Hitler, "I'll be one of the few men in history who have deceived the Vatican." The Pope wanted this because of the terror campaign that was already going on against Catholic youth and press. Within a couple of months, they had arrested 92 priests. And Pacelli himself said, we need to get an agreement on their lines or we face the elimination of the church in Germany. And Cardinal von Faulhaber has this great quote, without the Concordat we'll be hanged, drawn, and quartered. With the Concordat we'll only hang. So they knew they were in trouble, because of what had happened between February 27th and the time of the negotiations. They knew they were in serious trouble. So the response in a class, like a history class, the teacher says, the Vatican gave recognition to Hitler in this Concordat. That's not true, because it does not endorse a regime or a person. It's only made with the national government. It had nothing to do with Hitler. It had nothing to do with recognizing Hitler as government. It doesn't say that anywhere in the treaty. But it's rather that they wanted to spare the faithful as much as they could. Because if the negotiations failed, Pope Pius XI said, the hand of the church is always extended to anyone who did not actually refuse it. These are the different categories, and they're unusual categories at the end. The church always asks for freedom for its schools, for the bishops to communicate with Rome freely, for the right to teach in public schools, after hours, as some of you probably have done, to appoint bishops without government interference, for the protection of religious orders and their property and their ministries, for the right to establish seminaries. That was not permitted in Germany. There are all kinds of local laws against that from different anti-Catholic governments. And the theology faculties at universities, that was a really big thing to have that. Because the church didn't have a lot of backing financially to open up brand new seminaries. But they could add on to the theological faculties that are already at places that already exist. And the right to criticize religious policies in Berlin. Never in a Concordat was that asked for, the right to criticize the national government, the host government. And then these on Jews. That baptized Jews be recognized as Catholics, not as members of the Jewish race. Because there had been so much propaganda through Mein Kampf and in Hitler's speeches against the Jews, the Vatican could see where this was going, although nobody expected the Holocaust, mass extermination. But they knew there was persecution. And that intermarriage with Jews be recognized as valid marriages by the state. The church recognized them, but for the state to recognize them, because the state put pressure later on. The state put pressure on Aryans, all right, non-Jews, who were married to Jews to divorce them. And in the Nazi Nuremberg laws, if you divorced your Jewish spouse, the Jewish spouse lost all the protection of being married to a non-Jew. The Catholic Church, of course, forbids divorce and wanted this in there so that there would be no pressure in a Catholic marriage. They couldn't, by treaty, they could not put pressure on a Catholic couple, a Catholic spouse with a Jewish spouse. Okay. They signed the Concordat on July 20th, 1933. 5 days later, this is announced. They'll start sterilization for the perfection of the Aryan race. People that were ill, that had chronic illness, would be sterilized so they couldn't pass that on. People that were considered mentally defective or physically handicapped would be forcibly sterilized for the same reason. And the church files its first protest. 5 days after that, the Catholic Youth League is dissolved. In Germany, in German culture, it's very big to join clubs. It's a very big thing still, to be a member of something, all right, outside of the family. It's very important. And of course, Catholic Youth League was extremely important because this is where kids got their religion. This is where they met other Catholic kids and came together in mutual support. And this is the first creation of an underground in Nazi Germany, where what they did to get around this was they would, also in Germany, it's very big to go hiking in all kinds of weather. And so they would have these kids get together without uniforms on, without insignia, going on a hike. But when they got up away from the town, then everybody sat down and they got their religious instruction. So this is the second protest. Then in August, they started arresting Jews and non-Nazi political leaders. And then in September, the Nuremberg laws come out, which define the German citizenship and revoke citizenship for anybody of the Jewish race. This is also the Nuremberg laws, are when a category is created in Germany called Mischlinge. Mischlinge means mixed ones. So they went back. If you had one Jewish parent, you were half non-Aryan. So your blood was impure. If what grandparents were, they would go back to 1/4. It becomes a serious problem for these people as time goes on because their rations are lower. They weren't allowed to go in air raid shelters during the bombing of the cities. And they had no civil protection whatsoever. And anyone could do anything to them, and they had no recourse in law. They also would lose a profession because under these laws that were continually added to, Jewish people lost various rights to practice medicine. You couldn't practice medicine on a non-Jew. You couldn't hire a non-Jew as a servant. They couldn't have radios at one point. Their pets had to be surrendered to Aryan owners. And all these humiliations pile up over the years, building up towards Kristallnacht. And pressures on people, to leave Germany, to get out. So, we have these mass arrests of Catholic leaders. Some of them are expelled from the country, and they go to Switzerland or Austria. A lot went to Austria, because Austria had a Catholic government. And then these currency charges are brought up against priests and nuns. So first, there's this huge press campaign that people in the church are engaged in foreign currency. And the foreign currency was worth more than Deutschmarks were. The Reichmarks, people didn't want Reichmarks in other parts of Europe. And a lot of times, religious orders did have foreign currency because they were international. And money would come into them in other currency that they would take to the banks to convert to Reichmarks. So they were convicted on these currency violations. Then The next stage of the campaign was sexual immorality. Priests were accused of being molesters of children. Priests were accused of being homosexuals, of being active in homosexual rings, in violation of their vows. Nuns were accused of lesbianism and of molesting children. And they go to Dachau. Now people are being sent to Dachau. Dachau was not founded as a Jewish concentration camp. Dachau was founded as a political camp for people that were opposed to Hitler. So in 1937, the only encyclical written in German, Mit Brennen der Sorge, is read in all parishes. Now 300,000 people were involved in distributing the encyclical. It was written in Rome, in German, printed in Rome, smuggled over the border, mimeographed in larger quantities, and then members of the Catholic youth smuggled them around the country, sometimes a trick that was used later during the war. They would wrap it up very tightly and put it in their bicycle handlebars. So they would carry them all over Germany, so that on Palm Sunday the German government had no knowledge of the encyclical whatsoever. It was released in Rome on the same day. And Palm Sunday, everybody goes to church on Palm Sunday. You know, it's the beginning of Holy Week. People want their palms. Everybody goes to church who's going to go to church. And on Palm Sunday, it's very long. The priests go up into the pulpit and open their mouths, and the first three words are Mit Brennen der Sorge, with burning anxiety. And then it goes on to specifically denounce National Socialism in great detail. There is only one race. There are not two races. There's only the human race. The defense of human rights. The person is more important than the state. Nazism, fascism, communism all taught the same thing. The state is the most important thing, and people exist to serve the needs of the state and the party. Mit Brennen der Sorge says, no. You are here as a child of God, and all people are children of God. It says this phrase: weeds of suspicion, discord, hatred, calumny, a secret and open fundamental hostility to Christ and His church. Never says the word Hitler, but refers to a mad prophet who claims near divine status, which the Nazis knew who it was. They were furious about that one in particular. And parental rights, a right to religious education. Why did they have to put that in? Because there had been great pressure put on parents to pull their children out of Catholic school. Or, if there were no Catholic schools, to pull them out of religious education in the public schools. There was also a conversion of the public school syllabus to reflect National Socialism and Nazi ideas. And so they put this pressure on people. They would lose their jobs. If they were unemployed, they would lose their, check, from the government. Pension. Unemployment check. And religious education was being forbidden by the government. So that's why that's in there. Old Testament is still the Word of God. Why was that there? Because of this movement. The German Christians, Deutsche Christlichkeit, taught, and they were Lutherans, and the bishop, the head bishop in all of Germany for the Lutheran Church, for the evangelical church. The Protestant church in Germany was both Lutheran and Reformed. Kind of a confused situation. But anyway, the Reich bishop was a German Christian. They taught the Old Testament was corrupt because it came from the Jews, and that the Virgin Mary was not a Jew. She was a Persian, and that she was not conceived through the Holy Spirit. She conceived through the rape by a Roman soldier. And that's how Christ was conceived. He is not the Son of God. And Persian, why Persian? Because Persians were Aryans. They're considered to be Aryans by Nazi ideology. So the German Christians taught people that the Old Testament was not valid. And of course the Old Testament is used in all kinds of Christian worship. And finally, that the encyclical teaches moral law is eternal. And it trumps anything else. Okay. By 1938, there had been so many Vatican protests filed from the Secretariat of State, which was now run by Cardinal Pacelli. The Nazis actually tried to disavow it in their press on the basis that the church had failed to support Hitler, and therefore it didn't exist, it had no legal standing, you had no rights to be protesting. Now that's the other thing they did. The baptismal certificates, freely given to Jews without requiring baptism. The Catholic Church has never done that before. It's only here. And Cardinal Pacelli himself, after what's Kristallnacht? Do you know?
The night of broken glass.
The night of the broken glass. What happened? How did the glass get broken?
Mass vandalism against Jewish stores.
Right. And houses too. And the burning of the synagogues. The fire departments, when they were called, came and parked in front of the burning temples. It would only turn on the water if the fire was going to spread beyond the synagogue itself. So after Kristallnacht, then there's another wave of arrests. And people are lining up at foreign embassies trying to get out. So what happened was Cardinal Pacelli called in the different ambassadors that had relations with the Holy See. How many Jews would you take from Germany? And the answer was always none. There was anti-Semitism. There was also fear because everybody was under the Depression. There was not enough work to begin with in a lot of countries. So when he heard this, he called them in separately later and said, well, how many German Catholics would you take? Oh, that's fine, German. They have a good reputation, Germans. Yeah, well, we can take in German Catholics. Yeah, that's not a problem. Why? So that's what these people got then. They got valid certificates that priests would fill out and stamp with a parish stamp, and they could take that with their application to an embassy and say, well, I am a Catholic. And the doors would open. So that's why they did that. Okay, next one. So this is what people claim. So first off, they say the Catholic Center Party should have stayed. The Catholic Center Party, people will falsely say that the Concordat called for the dissolution of the Catholic Center Party. And that's not true. They'll also say that Cardinal Pacelli told them to dissolve. That's not true. And people will say, well, if the Catholic Party had stayed, there would have been an opposition then to Hitler. There's no guarantee of that, because in the early 30s, a lot of Germans supported Hitler. As by the vote, 43%. He had a very good spiel he gave. He had a good line he fed people about being in favor of so many different things that the ordinary person was in favor of.
Wasn't the Catholic Center Party also one of the targets for the Night of Long Knives?
Yes. A lot of Catholic politicians were murdered in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. And then when the protest was filed, by the Vatican embassy, they said, it was a terrible mistake. It was mistaken identity. They went to the wrong apartment. We didn't mean to kill him. But of course they did. So the party had dissolved before the Concordat was signed because of that, because of the persecution they were already experiencing. It wasn't safe anymore to identify yourself as a Catholic Center Party member or leader. That the Concordat gave international recognition of the Nazis. The League of Nations had already done so. And there have been other moves by other governments to already do so. So that's bogus. The Vatican did not protest enough. All right? In 6 years, they filed 55 protests, of which only 12 were answered. The rest were completely ignored, and the 12 that were answered was all insulting. And eventually what they figured out is there's no point And we're not going to get any further along. And the nuncio was weak, Cesare Arsenigo. He was weak. But Pius XI and Pius XII both feared that to remove him, that Hitler would not take a new one in. If there was not a nuncio in Berlin, then their link with Rome would be lost, because the nuncio's mail went out in diplomatic pouch and could not be opened, went out sealed. So even if they wanted to open it, they couldn't, because the seal would be, it was impossible to reseal. So, and now we know that Bishop Arsenigo actually did take a lot of actions in silent protest and in silent giving of help that people did not know about at the time. Okay. This is the other charge, that there was a hidden encyclical. Pius XI was working on this, and Cardinal Pacelli suppressed it when he became Pope. And that's not true. It wasn't finished. Pius XI ordered it in his last months alive. He never saw it. We know that because there's no notes on it. It's not hidden. It's very visible. You can see it anytime you ask for it. And this is the worst part. It contained a lot of stereotypes. The Italian priests who wrote it were very stereotyped about Negroes and Jews. Had it been published, it would have been a disaster for the Catholic Church, because it would have supported Hitler's views. So what happened is Pius XII took the good parts and he published his first encyclical, Summi Pontificatus, Darkness Over the Earth. October 20th, the war broke out on September 1st, 1939. He publishes this October 20th, and these are the main categories. He condemns all racism, he condemns dictators and totalitarian rule of a country, and he defends the Jews. So, when Pius was alive, during the war, first of all, during World War II, there were lots of Jewish expressions of gratitude towards him. During the war, the World Zionist Congress would deliberately write to him and ask for his assistance, because they knew he was helping Jewish people around occupied Europe. When he was elected, there was an outrage in German and Italian press over his election as Pope. How could the cardinals have done this? He's a supporter of the Jews and a supporter of the Bolsheviks. And he's a supporter of the communists. But the Jewish press in 1939 wrote, Pius XII is known as a staunch friend of Jews in Germany and Italy. In accordance with his instructions as papal secretary to the late Pius XI, Jewish visitors to the Vatican were served with kosher food. He was known as a vigorous champion of the Vatican's anti-Nazi policy. The anti-Semitic fascists tried hard to prevent Cardinal Pacelli's election. Their failure demonstrates the lack of influence of anti-Semites among the princes of the church. When Cardinal Pacelli had come to the United States, we had a priest in America named Father Coughlin, had an extremely popular radio hour. He was very much against President Roosevelt's policies, and he was very anti-Semitic. When Pacelli came and made a tour of America, he refused to meet with Coughlin, and he made a point of holding public meetings with Jewish leaders. And there's all kinds of Jewish press thanking him for doing so. In 1943, during the war, the World Jewish Congress respectfully expresses gratitude to your holiness for your gracious concern for innocent peoples afflicted by the calamities of war, and appeals to your holiness to use your high authority by suggesting Italian authorities remove as speedily as possible to southern Italy or other safer areas 20,000 Jewish refugees concentrated in internment camps that were in territory under Italian occupation in the Balkans, to prevent their deportation and the similar tragic fate which has befallen Jews in Eastern Europe. They knew Jews were being killed en masse. How did they know? Anybody know how they knew? It was the Vatican. 2 Jewish men escaped from Auschwitz and made it to Slovakia. They went to the Pope's representative. The Holy See did not have full relations with Slovakia because it was a fascist country. And they went to him and provided their eyewitness testimony of what was going on in Auschwitz. And he sent it to Rome, to the Pope. And the Pope sent it to Britain and America and asked the foreign governments to publicize what was happening. And what did they do with it? Nothing. They never publicized it. They said it was only rumors. And when the Pope's ambassador said, these men escaped, you don't only have their word for it. After all, they're Jews. So they didn't want to distract people from the war aims. So that's how they knew. Because then the church started announcing it, and then the press picked it up from the church, and then the governments finally had to acknowledge the truth of it. Our terror-stricken brethren look to your holiness as the only hope for saving them from persecution and death. With special gratitude, we remember all he has done for the persecuted Jews during one of the darkest periods of our entire history, the President of the World Jewish Congress. The chief rabbi of Denmark, if the Pope had spoken out against what was going on, Hitler would have probably massacred many more than 6 million Jews and perhaps 100 million Catholics if he had the power. Gold in my ear when he died. When the voice of the Pope was raised to the victims, in the life of our times was enriched by his voice speaking out in the great moral truths above the tumult of daily conflict. We mourn a great servant of peace, the chief rabbi of Israel, then Palestine. During the war, the people of Israel will never forget what His Holiness and His illustrious delegates, inspired by the eternal principles of religion, which form the very foundation of true civilization, are doing for our unfortunate brothers and sisters in this, the most tragic hour of our history, which is living proof of divine providence in this world. And he wrote in 1943, I take this opportunity to express my sincere thanks, as well as my deep appreciation of the invaluable help given by the Catholic Church to the Jewish people in its affliction. And the Pope interceded when the chief rabbi asked in 1944. He wanted to come and personally thank Pius XII for his intercession in Romania. The Pope interceded to aid 55,000 Jews in the province of Transnistria who were all at risk of death. And the chief rabbi of Romania, after that intervention, wrote, the Jews of Romania will never forget these facts of historic importance of the generous assistance of the Holy See. The Pope's mediation saved the Jews from disaster, a time where the deportation of Romanians was decided. The same year, the story was run, the Holy See is eager to rescue Hebrews. The New York Times said that he's the solitary voice on the continent of darkness. Albert Einstein, I never had any special interest in the church before, but now I feel a great affection and admiration because the church alone has had the courage and persistence to stand for intellectual truth and moral freedom. I am forced to confess what I once despised, I now praise unreservedly. The leading scholar on the extermination of the Jews in Hungary, it is a regrettable irony that the one person who in all of occupied Europe who did anything more than anyone else to halt the dreadful crimes and alleviate its consequences is made today the scapegoat for the failure of others. How did we get there? This is how. In the 1950s, actually it's at the end of the war even, the Soviet Union had a big campaign going to blacken the name of Catholicism. Why? Because in Yalta, we, the Allies, handed over all of Eastern Europe to Soviet control. In a couple countries, it was to be split 50-50, but otherwise it was 70-30, 60-40, or no Allied participation at all. And all of these countries have Catholic populations. Some of them are majority Catholic, like Czechoslovakia and Poland. They had to blacken the name of the Pope. And they had to blacken the name of the Catholic Church. So they start this propaganda. And in the 50s, it gets worse because the church is the only opponent left in any of those countries. Then, 63, this creep who's still alive today wrote this play, The Deputy, Rolf Hochhuth. He was an active member of the Nazi Youth League. And then, after the war, he settled in West Germany, in the Allied zone. But he got financial support from the Communist Party. It's a common theme in Eastern Europe. The brown shirts change easily to red shirts. It's a saying you find in Polish, Czech, Slovak, Hungarian, Serbian, Croatian. All the languages have the same proverb. Because the fascists easily became communists, because they're both into totalitarianism. He writes this play, The Deputy, condemning the Pope as cold, heartless, and wicked, and encouraging Hitler in the Holocaust. And in the playbill, when you go to a Broadway show, you get a playbill. In the playbill, he put this appendix of alleged sources, most of which are an anonymous bishop in Rome, who supposedly talked freely to him. The irony of this is, a Romanian secret agent, he was the chief of the Romanian Communist Secret Police. He's the one who says this. No one in Rome would talk like that. How did he know? Because he had agents in Rome who were dressed as priests and came with pedigrees claiming they were priests, working in Vatican archives and studies, supposedly medieval studies. Nobody would talk to that. They would try and worm information out of people at the Vatican. Nobody would talk to them about what went on. So he knew that that was not true. Okay. And then the West got on board. It's actually called the Pious Wars. And it's a series of books written to denounce Pius XII as wicked, that he was silent. That's the biggest thing, right? Pius XII was silent. He said nothing to stop the Holocaust. He did nothing to save Jewish lives. He was the voice of morality. Everyone would have respected him. They would have all listened to him. Why was the Pope silent? You see that in an evening news broadcast. You hear it all the time on this campus, any campus. It's a very common charge. And in all of the books condemning Pius XII, in all of them you find this. That they, at the end, right, they go through the wartime, they go through the Third Reich and the war, they always come up with this kind of thing. The church is outdated, the church is ignorant, the church has to change its positions. And one writer actually says the church has to give up believing that Jesus is the Son of God. All these things, all the doctrinal positions have to change because this is how we got in this mess. Right? That's why the church was silent in the face of the Nazis, because of all these things. And they didn't bother putting them on your bibliography because you can find them very, very, very easily. It's very hard to find the pro-Pius books. It's a piece of cake to find the anti. So, the different charges. First on himself, that he was cold and calculating. All the documents of the time said the opposite. People who met him described him as very warm, loving, charitable. He was very much a man of prayer. He was very much an ascetic. He fasted a lot. He did a lot of fasting. He did a lot of penance. He did a lot of personal intercession for the salvation of Europe. That he was anti-Semitic, which is kind of hard to believe given that his best friend in school was an Orthodox Jew, like Guido Mendes. He used to go over to the Mendes house on Friday night for Shabbat dinner, And he was there for the mother, leading the prayers in Hebrew. He learned Hebrew. And he borrowed books from them written by Jewish philosophers. So as a schoolboy, he learned Hebrew. Anti-Semites don't learn Hebrew. They don't think it's a language worth learning. When he was a diplomat, he intervened early against Poland's restrictions on Jews. Poland used to be the great refuge for Jews, but in the interwar years, it had a very authoritarian government that also was anti-Semitic. So he intervened against that. He supported the Jewish homeland in Palestine. He met with Zionists. Zionists are people who pushed for the creation of Israel. One came and was told that the cardinal was very ill, could only meet with him for 5 minutes. He met with him for an hour and a half. And when he came out, he said he was such a warm, loving person. He was so interested in Jewish affairs, and he wanted them to have a homeland. And in fact, he predicted that they would have a homeland. And during World War I, in World War I, there was the genocide of the Armenians and the Assyrians, which is happening again in the Middle East under Islamic State. He intervened with Germany, because he was the only ambassador in Germany from the papacy, because they found out, the Jews in Palestine found out that the Turkish governor was going to destroy all the holy sites and launch a massacre of the Jews as the British got closer to Jerusalem. And they cabled the news and eventually got to Pacelli, and Pacelli went to the German Army Department, which then he put pressure on them, and they put pressure on the Turks to pull back. And so nothing happened. And then when the Italian government started firing Jewish professionals, he hired Jews to work in the Vatican itself. He helped Guido Mendes and his family emigrate. He was praised by Zionist leaders. I talked about that already, the 200,000 baptismal certificates. Go ahead. He was pro-Nazi due to his connections with Germany. They ignore that all of the fascist and Nazi papers in Italy and Germany condemned him and charged him with these terrible crimes of being a Jew lover, a Bolshevik, anti-German. The other charges, he was anti-Semitic. He had Jewish friends, he hired the Jewish workers. The newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, is the official newspaper of the Holy See. It published 27 condemnations of anti-Semitism in that time frame, of July 1938 to January 1939. And the radio did more than that. The radio was very important. Vatican Radio had a big audience, still does. But Vatican Radio in Europe had a very big audience because as countries would fall to the Nazis, the programming was taken over. And the news, of course, was taken over. There was no independent press. The old names were kept on a newspaper masthead, but it was all Nazi stuff. And the same thing happened in France, in Belgium, in Holland, everywhere. So people would tune in to Vatican Radio because Vatican Radio would tell them what was going on. The other thing Vatican Radio did was people would write to Vatican Radio asking for news of their sons who had been captured or were missing. And the different Vatican diplomats would go into the prisoner of war camps to find out if they were there, and then send the names and where the people could write to them. And then that would be broadcast. Well, Jewish people did the same thing, whose relatives were in occupied countries, and they didn't hear from them anymore. The diplomats would go to the ghettos and see if they were still alive. And then they would do the same thing on Vatican Radio. They would publish to so-and-so who wrote, yes, your family in such and such city is still there, or no, they are gone. They have been sent east. They've been deported. And in 1942, then the Vatican Radio publicizes that testimony that came to Slovakia. So Vatican Radio was extremely important. And there's that nice quote, the only bright spot in Italy has been the Vatican. Okay, go to the next one. All right, points to remember. Holy See is neutral. All right? There was non abbiamo, ne prende zorga, then divini rende temptoris, which condemns communism. If one side is condemned, the other side has to be condemned. Pius told the Allied diplomat, when Italy entered the war, all the Allied diplomats had to move into Vatican City. Vatican City is very small. It's very, 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 very small. They could not live in a residence outside of the Vatican that was Vatican-owned. They had to be in Vatican City. That was the treaty. When they wrote the treaty, they never thought that there'd be all these countries at war with Italy. So he told the Allied diplomats, he says, if I condemn Nazi atrocities, then I have to condemn the Soviet ones. And the Soviets were an ally. He said, I have to be even-handed, because if I'm not, the Nazis will use that against us. And the silence. Why? Why the silence? In 1942, I need to sit down. In 1942, the Nazi governor of occupied Holland brought in all of the bishops from the Catholic Church and the leaders of the Protestant churches, and told them that they were going to begin deporting Jews out of Holland. But if you keep silent and do not protest, we will not deport any Jew who has converted to Christianity or is married to a Christian. And the Protestant churches went along with it. The Catholic bishops would not. And they wrote a pastoral letter, and it was sent out, smuggled out to all the churches in Holland. And it was read aloud in all of the churches in Holland, condemning National Socialism and condemning the deportation of Jews from Holland. And because the Nazis had already itemized everybody of Jewish ancestry in Holland, they promptly went out and arrested all of the Catholic Jews. Every man, woman, and child. They were all deported, and practically none of them came back. They were almost all murdered as soon as they got to Auschwitz. St. Edith Stein is one of them. And when they go to the Carmelite monastery, she's a cloistered nun. And the Reverend Mother says, she's in the cloister, she can't hurt you. And her sister was living in the monastery as well. They both were Catholics. Edith Stein was a nun. Rosa had converted. Her sister Rosa had converted as well. And she said, but we are waiting for visas from Switzerland, because our Carmel in Switzerland is going to take them. So can't you just wait? No. Everybody had to go. There was no mercy. The descriptions, of what happens to them are terrible. Just in Holland, what happens to them is terrible. These families, they're devastated. And there were nearly, of the Catholics, Jewish Catholics who were deported, nearly 100 were priests and nuns. They all went. Everybody was taken. And almost all were murdered when they got there. All of the priests and nuns were killed right away because they were useless. They were of no use. They didn't want priests and nuns in Auschwitz. So, that was one lesson. Second lesson came from Poland. Poland is the first victim of the war. The Holy Father is informed by Polish Catholics of what's happening. Churches closed, priests arrested, bishops arrested, monasteries closed, and the rounding up of Jews, putting them into ghettos. And so he issues a protest over Vatican radio. And the Cardinal Cardinal Hahn wrote, please never do that again. Because all that it did was make everything worse. They arrested more priests, they arrested more nuns, they went in more monasteries, they closed more churches, and they beat people and arrested people and sent them to camps. Don't ever do a protest like that again. Protestant pastors in Dachau. Why doesn't your leader shut his mouth? We pay the price each time. That was communicated to Rome. Every time the Catholics said anything, especially the Pope, they would come after the clergy. They would go in the clergy barracks. 95% of the men in the clergy barracks were priests and Catholic seminarians. They would come through there with worse beatings, atrocities, hanging, horrible things that they would do to them. And then he was deeply involved with the resistance in Germany, beginning in the 30s, not just the war. And they told him that he was going to have to keep quiet on a number of things, because otherwise the Nazis would react. Whenever the Vatican did say or do anything in writing or verbally, there were always negative consequences in the territory involved. So, okay. The other point is said that, yes, Jews were hidden in monasteries and convents, but they did that on their own initiative. Yes, bishops wrote letters telling priests to do this, but they did that on their own initiative. Why did they say that? Because there's nothing in writing. There's nothing in writing. The Catholic Church is a very hierarchical church, especially then. Papal enclosure. A cloistered monastery, the Carmelites in Santa Fe, are under papal enclosure. No one can lift papal enclosure except the Pope. Cloistered nuns and cloistered monks are very conservative. They don't do experimental liturgies. No, they're conservative by nature and their vocation. And they most certainly, the nuns, were not going to let men into the cloister. A Catholic priest needed permission to go into the cloister. In those days, if a priest came into the cloister to administer sacraments to a sick sister, a sister went ahead of him ringing a bell so that any sisters that were out in the corridors could go inside and close the door so they would not be seen by him. Papal enclosure is very, very strict. There's no way that they would have done this on their own. Bishops would not have put their dioceses at risk in occupied Europe. They simply would not have been done. Now, this is the accusation. There's no written document revealed yet. Right? Part of the Vatican archives have not been opened yet. Why? Because those that were written were burned. We have testimony from people who, the bishop read me the Pope's letter. I saw the Pope's letter. I received a request from the Holy Father. You find that over and over again. But they're all destroyed, and the letters came with orders to destroy it. So, Holocaust deniers will say, well, the Holocaust didn't really happen, and the extent that they said it did, and Hitler didn't really do it because there's no order from Hitler. And in Nazi Germany, they wouldn't have done anything without Hitler's orders. Well, yeah, that's right. They wouldn't have done anything without Hitler's orders. Hitler was very much involved in the Holocaust. So if you say that because you can't find a written document, Hitler was no fool. He wasn't going to sign his name to any of those documents at the Wannsee Conference. He wanted international opinion to have a favorable opinion of him. So there's no document like that by Hitler, and there's no document so far like that by Pius XII. Next one. Is that it? Okay, so here are, you got any questions? Yeah.
At what time does Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky become the primate for the Ukrainian Greek
He already
Catholic
was.
Church? Okay, and when does his involved efforts in saving the Jews begin?
His efforts in saving the Jews begin with the Nazi invasion of Eastern Poland. Poland was divided between two spheres of influence of Nazis and Soviets, and they were in the Soviet zone. And Metropolitan Sheptytsky actually had close Jewish friends, particularly among the rabbis. He himself was crippled and had to be carried. He was in very bad shape, but they didn't replace him because of the political situation right before the war. It was so delicate. And so he thought he shouldn't resign, and he dies right at the end. But Sheptytsky is involved. He does the same thing with monasteries. He orders the monasteries to take in Jewish children in particular. Parents wanted their children saved. The parents will do anything to save the life of their children. And they really wanted the kids saved first. And then also Sheptytsky ordered the priests to give out baptismal certificates. That if any Jewish person came asking for a baptismal certificate, they were to do that. Now, why it was dangerous to issue these certificates was that the Nazis would ask for the parish register. And see, you would have to date it in most cases before 1940 or 1938. And if you look in the register, that entry does not exist. So if they went and pulled out the registers, then that priest would be arrested. So they had to hide the registers. So that was that's why the certificates were so important, because they could claim, that volume is lost. Oh, you'll have to write to the bishop's office for that, And they would delay. But that's what Sheptytsky did. And Sheptytsky issued his own pastoral letter because Ukrainians had been involved in the killing of Jews alongside the SS, and he issued a letter, "Thou shalt not kill."
Right.
And a very important letter that was, like the others, by the Pope. It had to be mimeographed in secret and then distributed in secret and then read in church with no prior warning. So that's when he was involved. Our bishop in Slovakia did the same thing. Our bishop ordered the priests to issue baptismal certificates. Because in Slovakia, if you had a baptismal certificate, you could not be deported and your family could not be deported. So if you issue even, what did they, I think they issued up for the Byzantine Catholics, issued like 500 certificates, because we're only 3% of the population in Slovakia. But that saved over 1,100 people. So that's what they do. Anybody else? Yeah.
During the interwar period, the leader of Austria, Adolphus,
Yes.
how was he with the issue with, persecution of Jews and Catholic action, etc., etc.?
Yeah, Adolphus was a Catholic. He was the president of Austria. He was very anti-Nazi. And he was murdered by the Nazis.
Right.
So he's killed before they take over Austria. But he pretty much went along with Pacelli's line.
But was it, because I know that he's remembered as a, quote, fascist.
Yeah, I know. Because he was, Austria was going through a civil war, all right, between the socialists and the conservatives. And there was actually not just street violence, there was actual bombardments taking place in Vienna itself.
Right.
So he created this kind of a government, a corporate republic, where he had most of the power. And he did that because the parliament simply was unable to act. It was so divided. And under this corporate state, which was a dictatorship, it was, but it was the only way to get peace in the country. And he was no persecutor of the Jews. Now, after he was murdered, Schuschnigg is appointed as the Chancellor of Austria.
Right, and he was just a puppet of Hitler, basically.
Well, Schuschnigg was afraid for the country.
Right.
And when the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria takes place, Schuschnigg set up a plebiscite throughout all of Austria with a question: do you favor a free, independent Austria that will continue to follow its own traditions, or do you want to become part of Hitler's Third Reich? It was a very loaded question, the way it's written. It's very loaded. You know, that obviously you're not going to be a patriotic Austrian if you vote for the Reich. You have to vote, you know, for Austria. But when Hitler found out about the plebiscite, he wasn't a puppet of Hitler, but he was scared how to save the country.
Right.
Now, what goes with this is, it's good you brought this up actually. Initzer was the Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna. So, the Germans attack. The Austrian army calls for permission to fight back. But Schuschnigg knew they were outgunned and outnumbered. And he didn't want blood to be spilled, and he said, no, give up, surrender. And the army wanted to fight. Countries make a lot of mistakes to Hitler. All the countries presumed Hitler would, if they stopped Hitler, that he would go to war again. Because the World War I was only 20 years before. And it had destroyed an entire generation. And these were the sons of the veterans who would have to go to war. And nobody wanted a war again, because World War I had been so awful. So when he remilitarizes the Saarland, when he remilitarizes Rhineland, you know, nobody does anything. And that's why they buckle down with Czechoslovakia. What happens is they come in, you've all seen the pictures, all these people wildly welcoming Hitler because he brought peace to Germany, he brought jobs to Germany, so he's going to do the same thing for Austria. So then the Nazis put out a plebiscite. You vote yes or no for the Anschluss, but it was open voting. And then Initzer, the fool, the Cardinal of Austria, but he was a fool, he comes out from voting and he gives the Nazi salute. This shows up on the newsreels all over the world. And Pope Pius XI orders him to come to Rome. And they gave him a dressing down that he left. They said his face was as red as his robes. And he had to go back. And he had to apologize. He had to work to protect people who were under persecution. He got all kinds of orders of things that he had to do to try and mitigate the damage that he had already done. And so he finally gives this big sermon to the Austrian youth pilgrimage in the Cathedral of Vienna. And it condemns the Nazis in the sermon. So he did do what they told him to. The Nazis attacked the palace the next night, stormed through the doors, beat up the priests, throw priests out of the windows, and terrorized him. And, you know, the answer from the Vatican was, what did you think they were going to do? This is what they've been doing in Germany, you know, for 5 years. You thought this would be different? They were really angry at Initzer.
Right.
Initzer. Schuschnigg spent the entire war in a concentration camp with his wife.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and the son was drafted, and the son was Kurt Jr. He wrote a book about their time. He was allowed to go once or twice to see his parents.
If I could get like your brief thought on, since Dollfuss was basically a big part of Catholic action and all of these other things. I mean, a lot of people I've heard have said that Dollfuss in Austria was basically probably one of the greatest achievements of the Catholic action movement in a way. Why is it that certain people that would be like Catholic worker, Mary Knoll, that they remember Dollfuss as a fascist then?
Because he did run a dictatorship. He ran a country with with authoritarian tendencies. But it's totally unfair to call him a fascist. He's not a fascist. You know, he used Catholic doctrine God, I can't think of the word now. Yes.
Solidarity?
Solidarity, but no.
Subsidiarity?
Subsidiarity, local government, all right? And for things to be done on a small local level rather than waiting for the government to do it. And the idea was, to transform society and to re-Christianize it, because even then, a lot of Austrians weren't going to church. But the church still had a lot of influence, even with people that only went, on Ash Wednesday and Easter Sunday. So, that was a disaster. But, that's why and it's unfair. It's very unfair to call him that. There's a good book about him. It's a fairly recent book about him. If you go for a search in books, you can find it. I don't know the title of it. Victor, you had a question?
I was just going to ask, how was JP2 able to avoid being captured?
So when he wasn't a seminarian yet, okay, when they invaded. And what he did was he signed up to work in a quarry that produced materials that they needed for the war industry. And the workers protected him because they knew when he joined, he said, when you're an intellectual, look at your hands. You don't have a blister on you. And during the lunch break, he would always be reading philosophy and theology. So they would hide him. And they were his big defenders. And some of them, then when he became Archbishop of Krakow, they were his big supporters against the communists. So what he is involved in the illegal theater productions that were always a Polish patriotic place. And he finally discerns that he's called to the priesthood, and he applies to the cardinal to become a seminarian. And then what they did was they put him in an underground seminary in one of the residences where the men were hidden. And he lived the last 2 years hidden. And that's how he evaded capture.
Did he ever come close to maybe
Yes.
getting caught? Really?
Yes. He came very close during roundups because the Germans would do roundups of people on the street. He was involved with some underground activity. And he did come close. And the seminary, where the Nazis thought the seminary was raided. So, but they weren't there, fortunately.
Didn't he hide in the vents and stuff?
I don't know.
Probably like in an event one time so they wouldn't catch him.
Oh, in a van.
A vent, like in the.
Oh, a vent.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll have to read it. Yeah.
Father, could you describe the moral ramifications of being a soldier, like either by volunteer or by draft, and fighting for, say, the Wehrmacht during the war?
So this fella, he was an Austrian, Franz Jägerstätter. He was a young farmer, married, had a couple of little girls. I knew his wife, his widow. His position was that you could not, when your draft notice came, that you should not fight because it was for a godless enemy of the church. And he was not that well educated theologically. He had been something of a hellion as a young man. He was known in the town for his flashy motorcycle and his loud rides on the motorcycle. When he got married, he settled down and was, running a regular farm with his wife and raising a family. And he refused to go. So he was put in prison, and the bishops would not back him. And he was put on trial, and he was condemned, and he was beheaded. And so when one of the last priests trying to change his mind said, "But Franz, what if everybody did what you're doing?" And he said, "Yes, Father, exactly. What if everyone would do what I'm doing? It would end the war." So that priest ended up going to Francisca, his wife, and apologizing to her. And the feelings are so strong against him because so many young men died from that town that it was a struggle to get him memorialized. And that priest was the one who had a plaque made commemorating him, because he was cremated, there was no grave. They put a big plaque on the wall of the church in St. Radegund, his town, commemorating him and his witness and all that he did and the heroic inspiration he gave. And there was a conflict for a lot of men, especially, in the first years of the war, no, because they're fighting a war and the wars were short. Poland was destroyed because Britain and France did nothing, and the Russians invaded from the other side when Poland had a treaty defending them. Instead, the Russians invaded and took over a third of the country.
So you mean then, if
So
you're a member of the standing Wehrmacht in September of 1939, and you're ordered to move into the Danzig corridor, and to take Danzig.
Remember, the radio said that the Poles had made attacks on the German
I know
border.
those were false flags, but so you're a member of the standing Wehrmacht, and so volunteer, and you're given orders from your superiors to advance.
Right.
Was it immoral? Would it have been immoral for a Catholic soldier in the standing Wehrmacht to follow those orders?
He would not have gotten any support, and to be honest, they didn't think of it. Why? They took an oath. And the German people all over Europe at that time, they took their word very seriously. And in Germany, you had to take an oath, not to the Constitution. The Nazis changed it from the Constitution to the Führer. You took an oath to obey the Führer and whatever the Führer ordered. So the soldiers did what they were told to do. Now, where I was going is, the war in the first couple of years is lightning speed. All right? They invade Belgium, they invade Holland, they invade Norway, and all these countries fall. France collapses, totally collapses. And Italy declares war on France to get in on the goods. And people saw this flood of stuff coming into the country. It looked like everything was going so well. Hitler was a military genius. It wasn't going to be a long war. Britain would have to surrender. It was all alone. There was nobody else. What starts doing them in early is the Jews. Because the SS follows the Wehrmacht, and the SS starts massacring Jews and Poles. And the SS goes and arrests innocent civilian families because they're Jewish, and then there are these deportations to the east, and gradually disaffection builds up in the army. And you see it in the letters that they sent home, and then it became dangerous to write it because all their mail was read by the military censors, and a lot of those men were arrested and jailed or put in punishment battalions. So, for a country at war, people thought they had to defend and support their government, just as we would. Just like, when we invaded Iraq in 2003. The president did not know that the intelligence he got on mass weapons of destruction was wrong. Nobody knew that. They didn't know until much, much later. So even though the Pope said America should not invade, there was no American Catholic in the armed forces who said, well, you know what, the Pope is against this war, I can't go. Now, our men wouldn't think like that, raised in a free democracy. How would these young men think after 6 years of unmitigated Nazi propaganda in their schools and years prior of conflict in their country that only Hitler seemed to fix?
So I
You
think
would have gone.
that answering my question, you're saying that Herr Jägerstätter's his response was morally permissible.
His response is very morally permissible.
And praiseworthy.
Yes.
But also.
But rare. It was very
It
rare.
also would, but I mean, presuming that the orders aren't explicitly, like being part of the SS or part of the Wehrmacht divisions that were,
Right.
that it did things like civilian massacres or, hard to say.
That's where you find the resistance.
So basically,
That's where you find
so-
resistance in the army, yeah.
So you're saying that, like basically, simply being a member of the Wehrmacht, like a normal average soldier, in the army fighting on the Eastern Front, whether it was when they were on the advance or on the retreat and then defending and so forth, that could also be a morally permissible and acceptable decision.
They thought they were fighting against communism, especially the ones, for the Eastern Front after 1940 when the war, when Hitler invades in 1941. It was a crusade against communism. It was advertised as that in the press and on the newsreels. That's what it was, to destroy the communists once and for all. And just take this, and then in the retreat, they saw what the Russians were doing as they invaded Europe, all right, liberated Europe. And they knew what was going to happen to their homeland. So they fought very hard in the East, very hard, to try and prevent that from happening, because then you're up trying to save your family. So it's a different ball game. You don't care anymore about how wicked Hitler is. You don't want these Russians to get to your town and your wife, your mother, because they basically conquered by rape. Chris?
Why would Hitler take such a strong stance against the Catholic Church, but then maintain a core of Catholic priests in the Wehrmacht SS and the Rotes Crews?
Because if he didn't have Catholic chaplains, the Catholic soldiers would not have gone. But the Catholic chaplains were forbidden to do anything other than administer sacraments to soldiers. They all broke that rule and gave sacraments to civilians in the occupied territories because especially when they got into the former Soviet territories, there were no priests, and people were desperate for priests to bless them with sacraments, baptism, and marriage. One priest said that he baptized one day for 10 hours. The soldiers would have not gone with the threat of death had they not had chaplains. And the chaplaincy corps was not trusted whatsoever by the higher-ups in the party. And they were persecuted. Under his wings, the name of that book?
Yeah.
Father Goldhagen? Yeah, and he brings that out. Yeah, they were really persecuted. So, okay.